Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Podcast. My name is Stefan Köbke, and this video is being produced as a project under the supervision of Professor Michal Smetana here at Charles University in Prague. Today, we will discuss recent technological changes with regards to nuclear weapons and the impact that this might have on the future of nuclear non-proliferation and nuclear deterrence at large. One of the key reasons that nuclear warfare has not occurred so far is the idea of mutual assured destruction, or MAD. This means that states will not attack each other with nuclear weapons, because they must fear that others will strike back, which would spell massive destruction on both sides, as each side can simply annihilate the other. In other words, nuclear deterrence is based on what Lester Pearson, a Canadian diplomat, and later Prime Minister, called in the 1950s balance of terror. This idea, the fear of retaliation with these highly destructive weapons, keeps nations from using them, because no side will risk their own destruction. But that doesn't mean that no one has thought about the idea of limited nuclear warfare. People have contemplated whether an exchange of weapons could be restricted enough to not spell doom for everyone involved. These approaches are known as nuclear utilization theories, or NUTS for short. MAD implies targeting the other cities and infrastructure to deal a devastating blow, which is known as a counter-value strike. NUTS implies that nuclear strikes are limited to military targets only, which is known as counterforce. So essentially, you will hit troops, barracks, military industry, etc., including the enemy's nuclear arsenal. This is also based on the idea that a strike on military targets is much more forgivable than one on civilian targets, and could thus limit the escalation of the nuclear exchange. Now, I should note that counter-value and counter-force are very surgical terms for what is essentially the mass killing of human beings. Counter-value, for instance, also means destroying schools, hospitals, and killing thousands, if not millions of people. Another issue is the fact that you may not be able to fully separate counter-value and counter-force strikes. These concepts are theoretical, and the cutoff where one starts and the other stops may not always be clear. What about military facilities close to cities? What about barracks or important military industries surrounded by civilian housing? How do you only destroy one without the other? Limiting the side damage of nuclear explosions is a key problem for counterforce strategies. Now, what's more, the ability to retaliate, also known as the second strike capacity, as opposed to the ability to attack, which is the first strike capacity, is obviously quite important to states, which means that they need to protect their arsenals from being destroyed by an enemy first strike. One method for that is hardening, which means fortifying silos, placing your weapons in bunkers or tunnels where they could be protected from a strike. North Korea is, for instance, digging tunnels into its mountains for this purpose. In order to destroy these well-protected targets, one would need a sizable explosion, possibly with nuclear devices, which brings us back to the question of limiting damage. So hardening is one strategy. Another strategy is concealment. That means hiding your nuclear weapons. This is, for instance, very important when it comes to nuclear-capable submarines, which are very hard to find and very hard to track in the vast oceans of the world. Essentially, if your enemy does not know where your weapons are or how to reach them, he cannot knock them out with the first strike. That means not only would a nuclear counterforce strike need to be strong enough to wipe out enemy missiles and planes before they could be used to retaliate, but they would need to know where those targets are in the first place. And that is not that easy, especially if you think about how vast countries like the US, Russia, or China are, and how quickly one can change the position of a nuclear bomber, or a submarine, or a mobile missile launcher. If we take a look into history for a second, We can see that these concerns can explain why a nuclear first strike has not occurred yet. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, for instance, when the Soviets had placed nuclear missiles on Cuba, there were people in the American military establishment that did advocate for a counterforce strike against these weapons. We know, for instance, that General Maxwell Taylor, at the time chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, as well as the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, at least contemplated airstrikes for this purpose. Now, why did the Americans end up using a blockade instead? One possible answer of many is because they could not be sure to actually manage to destroy all the nuclear weapons on Cuba. Back in the day, intelligence gathering occurred often via airplanes, flying over the enemy, taking pictures that then had to be developed. So there's a huge time delay and a lack of accurate data on where all the enemy targets are. And in the meantime, obviously, the enemy can simply reshuffle his troops. If even a few warheads survive a strike or manage to be fired before an airstrike can hit, then you run the risk that one of your own cities may be wiped out in retaliation. President John F. Kennedy at the time was well aware of the risk, stating that, I quote, "The fruits of victory would be ashes in our mouth." This little example shows that reaction times and accuracy matter. The fact that both of these variables can be quite unclear in the heat of conflict makes counterforce strikes quite hard. With unclear data, it is hard to gauge the enemy's possible reactions and the danger they could spell for your own nation. If you are coming in for a counterforce strike, the enemy may not know which target, city, or military installation you try to hit. Modern nuclear warheads often have something called multiple independent re-entry vehicles, or MIRVs for short. That means one missile can have multiple warheads that each target different locations. So your enemy may not know whether you seek limited warfare by only hitting a few military sites, or if you actually seek to deal a devastating counter-value blow instead. But that's not just the only aspect. Coming back to the problem of limiting the damage to civilians, imagine a target was so hardened one would require a nuclear warhead to fully disable this fortified site. Even if you'd managed to take out the enemy's arsenal in one first strike, without them being able to retaliate, using nuclear weapons can create devastating humanitarian and ecological consequences due to fallout. Fallout, for those who are not familiar with the term, essentially means that if a nuclear bomb hits a target on the ground, the debris from the explosion that is carried upwards will be radioactive. This radioactive dust is highly dangerous for humans, animals, and plants and will be carried by winds over a distance of hundreds of kilometers. So a massive region will be contaminated with these harmful materials, which can cause death and severe illness and even malformations of children. And that's not all. Another effect is the ecological catastrophe caused by the dust rising up above the clouds, where it cannot rain down and blacking out the sunlight for long periods of time. The resulting drop in temperatures would cause massive crop failure, starvation, and natural catastrophes. So we're not just talking about humanitarian disaster, but also an ecological one, which can reach far beyond the actual zone of conflict. So in practice, what we should keep in mind is that counter-value and counter-force strikes, as well as the ideas of MAD and NUT, are theoretical concepts. This very clean-cut idea of a counter-force versus counter-value strike is in practice much harder to see, and both can spell mass casualties. No arsenal in history has ever been fully based on either counter-force or counter-value, and the borders remain quite elusive. Now, so far, we have talked about issues resulting from a lack of accuracy and data with regards to concealment, the problem of enemy retaliation, and the general issue of using nuclear warheads for counterforce strikes against hardened targets. But technology is moving ever forward. There have been quite some important changes and trends over the past years, which is what we will talk about today. For instance, there's a paper called The New Era of Counterforce, published in 2017 by Keir Lieber and Darrell Press, which two very distinguished American scholars of security issues and nuclear problems in particular. They explore several of these issues I just outlined. In particular, they have an interesting take on the feasibility of limited nuclear warfare resulting from the development of so-called low-yield weapons. So before, I said that one of the limiting factors of nuclear warfare, why it hasn't occurred, is, amongst other reasons, the possible number of casualties through nuclear explosions that would be needed to destroy hardened targets, as well as through the resulting fallout. Normally, you'd need a very strong warhead to really destroy a strongly fortified and possibly buried target, which partially results from a lack of accuracy inherent to missiles, and made worse by the fact that you may not know exactly where the weapons actually are. This obviously entails the aforementioned negative side effects. So it's very hard to find a weapon that is both strong enough to knock open the targets of your enemy and that at the same time limits the damage. Obviously, killing thousands, if not millions of people as a side effect, causing a giant ecological catastrophe is in nobody's interest. But what if you could take a very weak warhead and you'd explode it high enough above the target so as to barely cause any fallout? You need to be incredibly precise in your targeting if you still want to manage to destroy your hardened target, right? And this possibility is exactly what Lieber and Press explore. Technological advancements in missile fuses enable much more precise airburst explosions. So essentially, instead of having a relatively imprecise ground burst warhead with an enormous yield that would lead to mass death and fallout, you just have a highly accurate warhead with a very small yield that explodes in the air, thus limiting fallout and casualties. By yield, I should explain, we mean the amount of explosive energy that a warhead can unleash, measured in equivalents of TNT. So a warhead of 1 kiloton means that it causes as big of an explosion, so to speak, as 1,000 tons of TNT. Lieber and Press actually modeled the difference in those technologies on the computer. One side, a traditional W-88 warhead, which you can find, for instance, on nuclear American submarines, amongst others, has a relatively strong yield of 475 kilotons. Using North Korea as an example, they estimate that dropping 10 of these warheads on 5 imaginary missile sites during a counterforce strike, so 2 per each site, would lead to 2 to 3 millions of dead people and a massive fallout that would stretch over all of South Korea and Japan. However, they estimate that if instead you use the low-yield airburst B-61 warhead with only 0.3 kilotons, so 0.3 versus 475 kilotons, and you use 4 per target or 20 in total, so double of what we had before, then you would still have barely any fallout and only around 100 dead people, mostly enemy military at those sites. So 2 to 3 millions of casualties with our old technology versus only 100 with the new one. That's quite a huge difference and leads Lieber and Press to speak of an accuracy revolution, which could bring us into a new era of nuclear counterforce. But there are other important technological developments too. A paper by Jan Ludvík from our university called Strategic Patience Revisited, The Counterforce Effect, published in 2019, argues that numerous advancements, not only with low-yield weapons, but also AI data gathering and new missile technologies are changing the game. I mentioned before that for a nuclear strike, you obviously want to make sure your enemy does not have time to retaliate. You can achieve that by striking fast and by striking without having your missiles detected until it's too late to react. Jan Ludvík describes that, for this exact purpose, big nuclear players such as the US, Russia, and China are developing so-called hypersonic missiles and hypersonic glide vehicles. Hypersonic means that they are faster than 5 times the speed of sound, so roughly 5,000 to 6,000 kilometers an hour. And Ludvík estimates that some of these devices will be able to take speeds of up to 20,000 kilometers an hour. But that alone is not exactly a novelty. We have ballistic missiles already flying that fast. What's interesting, however, are the glide vehicles. Instead of flying a nice, predictable curvature around the globe, These devices can change course, fly below radar. This year, in 2021, China, for instance, made headlines with such a glider circumventing the globe. And the US has awarded billion-dollar contracts to construct such systems. Now, another advancement in technology that several scholars, amongst them Jan Ludvík, are predicting is the use of mass data gathering with the help of AI. This brings us obviously back to the problem of accuracy and the lack of data related to concealment and the speed of intelligence gathering. For instance, the traditional tools for finding enemy submarines would include acoustic sensors that would listen in certain areas if there are sounds emitted by such vessels. New technologies, however, enable highly precise and detailed real-time oceanographic models, including sonar, radar, and seismic data, and many other data sources that make the seas more transparent than ever. On the ground, analysts usually spend many hours, days, or even weeks deciphering where and when activities take place. But with modern military satellite cover becoming ever more sophisticated and image resolution increasing, we get a better and better picture of what is happening. So another example of technological advances is the incorporation of AI and machine learning in analyzing where activities take place. DARPA, the research brand of the American military, for instance, is developing several such systems. One example is their geospatial cloud analytics, a system that produces a massive stream of data about what happens on the ground, which is then analyzed using artificial intelligence. So if we put all of these elements together, the low-yield weapons, the hypersonic missiles and gliders, the enhanced means of data gathering, as well as other technological changes I haven't mentioned, then we can see why Lieber and Press speak of a new era of counterforce. The previous obstacles for counterforce strikes that we outlined, reaction times, accuracy, negative side effects, etc., seem to decrease, and concealment, as well as hardening under these technologies, could not only be very expensive and difficult, but outright impossible for nations with few economic means, such as North Korea. This is why Jan Ludvík concludes that the best strategy to deal with that country's nuclear arsenal is to essentially simply wait it out. Technology will make it obsolete sooner or later. That sounds initially counterintuitive, but it may be a thought worth having. Now, in conclusion, the question remains what this all actually means for the future of nuclear warfare. Are we moving towards an age of limited nuclear strikes? Are these developments really huge revolutions or just sensationalized hype? How will they impact nuclear arms control? And how close are we to a scenario where artificial intelligence could decide whether or not to deploy devastating missile attacks, perhaps even nuclear ones? That is quite an ethically important question as well. Now, in order to discuss these matters, I'm very humbled to welcome Professor Jan Ludvík himself to join me here today. Professor Ludvík is an assistant professor of security studies here at Charles University in Prague and a member of the University Center for Excellence. He is an expert on nuclear weapons, having published in journals such as Security Studies, the Journal of Peace Research, International Relations, and the Washington Quarterly. He also wrote a book called Nuclear Asymmetry and Deterrence: Theory, Policy, and History, published in 2016 by Routledge as a part of their series on global security studies. So without further ado, please welcome my terrific guest, Professor Jan Ludvík. Thank you, Professor Ludvík, for joining us here today for the interview. You wrote a paper called Strategic Patience Revisited: The Counterforce Effect, in which you explore changes in nuclear technology and changes in technology more broadly relating to nuclear deterrence. And just to give our listeners a few examples, you mentioned hypersonic missiles, including glide vehicles. You mentioned that there are massive contracts, for instance, by the US military to develop such hypersonic devices, missiles or glide vehicles, and that there's similar developments on the Russian and Chinese sides, You talk about how data gathering is being revolutionized by, for instance, a program called Geospatial Cloud Analytics. And you talk about the implications of low-yield weapons, as for instance discussed by Kierlever and Daryl Press. So there's a lot of hype around these, especially the hypersonic missiles. To what extent is that hype justified?
Well, it depends on the technology. I need to say that this paper basically draws on existing trends, but also uses some kind of speculation as to what is likely and possible, not actually being able to predict the outcome of all research projects, technological research projects in the realm of, say, nuclear weapons and strategic stability, but it shows a broader trend of technological advancements that will almost certainly change this traditional relationship fundamentally. Hypersonic weapons are one of that, and I think these are kind of a hype, as you said, especially the subfield of hypersonic weapons, which is most often like mentioned in the discourse about strategic stability, especially by people from policy sphere, think tankers, and these are long-range strategic hypersonic weapons that are under development or have already been deployed by countries like Russia and China, and sometimes people think that, yeah, that's cool, they're really fast, there's no defense against them, but in reality, current intercontinental ballistic missiles, they travel on hypersonic speed, so there's not that much difference when it comes to the time of these strategic strikes. But the current hypersonic weapons that, for instance, China and Russia develop for these strategic purposes, it's more about their maneuverability, which is clear reaction to the US effort to develop a missile defense.
Right, so it's triggered by US advancements in defensive technology. So this is offensive technology to counter defensive trends on the other side. That's quite interesting. And you mean with maneuverability, are you talking specifically about glide vehicles, for instance?
Yeah, exactly. There are, as you mentioned, there are various types of hypersonic weapons, and these glide vehicles that could basically change the trajectory. They should be able to better evade the missile defense as one that is being built by the United States. But obviously there are more types of hypersonic weapons. Basically, we can see 3 of them. First, there are these, say, hypersonic ballistic missiles. So that's really similar to what we already have. Then there are these glide vehicles, which are basically launched usually by the ballistic missile, and then they glide to its target. And the last category are hypersonic cruise missiles, and they basically fly on a flat trajectory, which make them difficult to detect, especially for the radar, because radar is limited by the Earth curvature, and some radars can see over the horizon, but it's more difficult to detect these things.
It's quite interesting to me how you said it's a reaction to American developments, because when I read it in news, and admittedly I don't actually read Chinese news or Russian news because I don't speak the languages, especially in American news, I'm thinking here especially of an article in the Financial Times. It's seldomly presented as a response and more as a aggressive sort of threat, if you will. That's quite interesting to me, how this is framed perhaps differently from, what the reality on the ground is. So what do you make, if we maybe briefly touch on these low yield weapons? There's this model that was this computer model run by Kira Lieber and Daryl Press that essentially shows that you can drop double the amount to double the number of nuclear weapons or North Korea and kill way fewer people, say 100 people as opposed to the usual 2 to 3 million that would such a strike occur. Now, this is a computer model. Would you agree with this general idea that they could be used in such a way?
Well, it's something that is based on the technological development and physical principles. It goes back to the improvements in accuracy of delivery systems. Something which we could see at the later part of Cold War became famous in the Gulf War when the US-led coalition basically defeated Iraq. And Iraqi army at the time was believed to be really strong, well-equipped, experienced after 8 years of war with Iran, and then United States just crushed them without any casualties. And part of that were these new weapons. And this improvement in accuracy makes a huge difference for nuclear weapons. But not only for nuclear weapons, for conventional weapons as well. Nuclear weapons basically produce or can unleash a lot of energy in one spot. But when you think about it, this energy basically decreases as it goes over the distance because it covers more and more distances, still the same energy. So energy per square inch is smaller and smaller. That means the more accurate you are, the less energy you need to destroy the target. For these low-yield weapons are essentially a possibility. You can now use smaller nuclear weapons that will have less collateral damage, but also I think it's damn particularly useful because today, when you know where the target is, you can usually destroy it without the need to resorting to nuclear weapons. And I don't think militaries are super happy about these low-yield nuclear weapons. There are only very few missions they can handle well or better than existing conventional weapons.
You brought up a good point that it was if you know where the target is. And as we know, there are several strategies that states use to ensure their second strike capability, and one is hardening, and the other is concealment. So concealment brings us to maybe the next technology. So we talked about delivery vehicles, hypersonic missiles or glide vehicles, and then the weapon itself, the low yield weapon. But obviously the key aspect is knowing where to drop it. So this brings us to an interesting idea that you also discuss in your paper about data gathering. We live in an age of the cloud, and we live in an age of mass data gathering, and quite often it's in the news for all the wrong reasons. But just to give an example from your paper, you essentially say, if we use North Korea as an example, you say, so North Korea, if it transports these missiles on mobile launchers, you say we don't quite know how long they would need to initiate a strike. For instance, if the US struck North Korea first, how long would North Korea take for a response? And you give the example, you compare it to Russian models, and I'm sure we can assume at least that the North Korean models are not better than the Russian models. And you say that they would take around 7 minutes to launch a counter response. And a hypersonic missile to hit these positions would take around 3 to 4 minutes. Hypersonic missile coming from maybe a sea launch device from outside. from outside the coastline. So that would leave us with 3 minutes, around 3 minutes to decide, is there, you know, when we have data collection, when we have intelligence, satellites, etc., it leaves us with 3 minutes to decide, is there actually a launcher being preparing for a nuclear second strike? And you said this would leave us with 3 minutes essentially for analysis, which is not something any human analyst in this massive stretch of land could feasibly do in 3 minutes to decide over a nuclear launch or not. And this brings us to this interesting idea that you mentioned before, this, for instance, amongst others, programs such as geospatial cloud analytics, which to me sounds more like a weather forecast, but actually implies something quite enormous. You talk about the possibility of AI taking on the job, or machine, like an AI that did machine learning, so to speak, to say it very, very plainly and very easily, that could learn to recognize such a target and then automatically strike back. You call that automated target recognition. Let me just ask you, how far away do you think, in terms of years, decades, how far away are we from such a scenario?
I don't know. These things are in a stage of development. I drawn as an example, and I need to say the overarching argument in the article we're talking about is that small and poor countries will find it increasingly difficult to compete with rich and powerful countries. Nuclear weapons gave countries like North Korea possibility to bring enormous destruction on countries like United States, which never happened before. It was not a possibility for small countries before the nuclear age. And I say, yeah, well, look, the technological development didn't stop, and at some point, probably there will be a solution. There will be new technologies that will not allow those who do not have resources to compete on a part of those who have resources. And I exactly use these projects which are in development by US Defense Advanced Projects Research Agency, which is really like famous research agency which supported historically some of the most breaking technologies like GPS, stealth, so on, so on. And the thing with this research is they're good. They manage to achieve to support some breakthrough technologies because their strategy is to support high-risk projects. In research, you never know whether you're going to find this new thing, and they have something like 90% failure rate in these projects. So we do not know what's actually going to be a success and when it is going to be success. It's difficult to say. When you think about your phone, it has face recognition technology. It's not perfect. You can fool it. If you use your phone and want to make a picture of, say, poster, it will recognize faces on the poster, and it will not be able to distinguish at this point that what is poster and what is real human face. So it can be fooled, but that's basically the idea. You can recognize, the AI can recognize patterns. It can learn how to recognize patterns. It can learn very well. So at some point, it might be able to recognize patterns of, well, this is a ballistic missile launcher in North Korea, and with enough computing power, it can do it really quickly.
It's quite interesting to me because, especially when you mention phones, it's perhaps a good example, especially for people at home to sort of imagine that, because I mean, the idea sounds quite futuristic of an AI recognizing if there's a nuclear strike or not. But if we think about the advancements, for instance, in our private sphere that have come so fast in the grand scheme of things, if you think back to how mobile phones were 25 years ago, and if you had told anyone that your mobile phone will recognize your face and play all your favorite songs and will enable you to connect with anyone in the world whenever you want, and just the existence, for instance, of Google Maps alone. Like the fact that you can drop yourself pretty much anywhere in the world, and on Street View, I know it's not every single street in the world, but you can drop yourself in Central Africa or in the Andes or wherever. And, you know, like some decades, if you had told that to someone in the 60s, they would have thought that it was a crazy idea. And yet here we are. So let's maybe just like remove from the question of when exactly. Because would you agree that it's more of a when rather than an if?
I think it's a matter of when. In terms of this being enabled, we do not know what the impact will be, because obviously there is a competition between, say, offense and defense. So those who are endangered by these new technologies will try to find countermeasures. Like we discussed hypersonic weapons before, and why China and Russia builds them. It is exactly because they think that at some moment, and they do not know when, the US missile defense program might work. They're aware of the current limitations. They know that the US missile defense does not threaten their second strike capability at this point. That what the United States have today is barely sufficient to stop North Korea, but they hedge against that. But in terms of possibility, I think it's more a question of when we will find a solution to automatically and very quickly recognize surrogates.
So perhaps if we delve a bit into this ethical question that I see here, is that, I mean, we talk about automated target recognition and AI, and it all sounds very technical, but what it means in ethic terms is quite interesting, because it essentially means handing handling over to a computer the ability to use devastatingly strong weapons. And if I think here, for instance, I mean, there are several questions that you know come to my mind here. I'm not going to bother you with all of these, but so one, for instance, would be, for me personally, the danger of technology failure. You know, we've seen that with, for instance, the famous case of, I'm sure there were others, but the famous case of Stanislav Petrov, you know, the man who saved the world, as in, you know, the book and the movie is out, who just very quickly, you know, saw these glimpses on his radar that indicated missile strikes and decided to, you know, there's something fishy about it. It's unrealistic. The US wouldn't strike, and he was, you know, aware of these, the weight of the decision, the ethical weight of the decision, and then decided not to launch back, which was ultimately the good thing, because it prevented a possible nuclear war. What if at the other end there is no Stanislav Petrov? What if at the other end there's a machine that doesn't care, so to speak, in a very neutral sense, about the ethical weight of that decision? Do you see a sort of moral dilemma in this?
There is certainly a moral dilemma. Actually, there are several moral dilemmas. First, there is a possibility that, as you said, machine will fail. However, there is also a possibility that human will fail. Considering how often humans actually err, it's more likely that the human error will cause the problem, not the machine error. But as the research shows, people would prefer to put their bet on the human error. We would rather trust fellow humans, even though they're more likely to make mistakes than to trust machines.
Yeah, this has also been, if you think about it, this has also been quite a topic in sci-fi literature and movies, and so it sort of captivated the human mind for quite a while. If you think about all sorts of, like, if you start with The Matrix, for instance, very famously, or movies like Blade Runner, etc. Just I don't know if I would call it a concern, but certainly thinking about the implications of computers or robots or anything machine-based becoming too human-like. And certainly also this plays into the concerns that I would have about, at the end, because in the end, for me personally, it's I mean, I just myself, I would find it, even though, as you say, humans err more often than machines, because humans are also captivated by emotional phenomena and groupthink, etc., misperceptions, that machines might not be to that extent. Machines might be more rational, so to speak. But I see also let's see, even if this worked perfectly, is it not a trend? Is it not part of a general trend towards the dehumanization of war? If you think about, for instance, just in IR theoretical concepts, James Derderian's the virtual war, sort of this removing the human element, especially on the attacker's side, removing the human element from the equation.
It certainly is, and I think these ideas of virtual order, they're really disturbing. We know from, for instance, from the drone strike, that there is a problem when direct connection doesn't exist between the target and the attacker. First, there is the ethical dilemma, but we also know that, for instance, drone operators, they really suffer from serious psychological problems. It's actually more demanding, more dangerous to be a drone operator than to be a fighter pilot, or at least it used to be in the context of war in Afghanistan and Iraq. Because the fighter pilots, we think, they still felt like being in the mission, being fighting, and then they rightfully destroyed their targets, while drone operators at some point will feel, hell, I killed people and it was like a computer game. That's probably not the right thing to do. Yeah,
certainly. It's good that you mentioned drone strikes, because just recently, at the time of this recording, there was a report by the New York Times, which investigated actually drone strikes by the American military, in that they found that drone strikes, although they were sort of, should I say, promised as a surgical solution, as a sort of precision strike guided by remote technology, et cetera, that it actually incurred way more civilian casualties than were admitted initially. And this really makes me think about whether technologies that are always promised to be so more flawless or sort of more refined in terms of technical elements, if they're actually all that much better. It's certainly quite interesting. I mean, I also see parallels to, the famous movie, Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, the doomsday device, that is sort of the machine deciding to, I mean, it's a satire, so the machine decides to destroy the world. Sorry for any spoilers for whoever watches this, but the movie's out for over 60 years now, or nearly 60 years. But yeah, it really, it's quite interesting how sometimes reality moves a bit more towards fiction than the other way around. So if we maybe come back to like a general overview of these trends. So we talked about hypersonic devices. We talked about these low yield weapons. We talked about AI. Putting them all together, and maybe this is a very broad question to you, is is this just the next step in a continuous change, or is this a revolution? Is this a real qualitatively huge step? What would you say?
Well, I think the idea of revolution is intellectually useful to help us distinguish the new things, but in reality, of course, these are always like continuous developments that we notice at some moment. It rarely is a truly like revolution, especially in the way that it makes the previous no longer relevant. But actually in human history, and I will speak about the history of warfare because it's something that I have an expertise. This expectation of revolutions is quite common. It almost always turns out to be a bit false expectation because there is a new technology which will be a game changer, but it's a game changer in a way how it cooperates with existing technologies, existing strategies, existing people in a way. So how you put these things together matters. It never is that there is a new technology and everything that we knew previously is no longer relevant.
Do you see the danger then, especially what I find very good here, you mentioned pre-existing people. And I'm thinking here, for instance, about, very classic example of World War I, the generals socialized in warfare from before, sending their soldiers to die in the machine gun fire because they didn't understand the change in tactics that was required. And if we put this on the nuclear scale here, this is something that I hear from the contemplations, for instance, by Lieber and Press, that are we moving towards enabling a limited nuclear war, a first strike, especially perhaps with regards, as you said, to countries that cannot keep up with this technology?
Well, obviously this is a speculation because we don't have any empirical data to draw from. Myself, I'm not that concerned that we're moving to age of limited nuclear strikes. What I think is more likely is the possibility of conventional strikes against small nuclearisms. That's what was discussed with respect to North Korea several times. This is discussed with respect to Iran. Obviously, Iranians do not have nuclear weapons, but it's quite possible that when you improve your ability to detect where the nuclear weapons are, you might be more tempted in a crisis to strike them. And when you can do it with conventional weapons, and that's what we know from history. Decision makers do not want to use nuclear weapons for these preventive strikes. That's a huge escalation, but they strongly prefer to use conventional weapons, which would eventually leave the burden of escalating to the other side. And I think it's not super likely, but it's the possibility of this happening it has really increased.
I see the danger also of a strike that would be too premature, that would not be the precision surgical strike against, for instance, nuclear weapons in North Korea. And that would then trigger, there would be remaining missiles that would maybe respond with a launch on South Korea or Japan, perhaps even trying to reach the western seaboard of the US. So that's certainly a development that I think should be watched more closely. And maybe if because we're moving towards the end of this interview, where do you see, especially you talked about how, smaller countries will not be able to keep up likely with these changes. And larger countries like China or Russia, they would probably try to keep up with the US. So there are several questions that come to my mind. For instance, about does it increase use it or lose it pressure? You know, especially for smaller arsenals, will they be more tempted to use them in the near future rather than having them obsolete, which is what you predict for the nuclear arsenal of North Korea? So just briefly, maybe for, do you see such problems occurring maybe that would make the situation worse?
It's hard to say. I was never particularly convinced with this use it or lose it logic, because it's actually committed suicide logic. And unless the attacker is so stupid that they are telling you we'll kill you anyway, you will probably prefer not to use your nuclear weapons and somehow make them safe until the last moment. Try to prevent them from being destroyed, but not really using them. I think that's the idea behind what Donald Trump administration called the bloody nose strike on North Korea. Basically, even though they couldn't guarantee destruction of North Korea's nuclear weapons, they believe if we strike them and tell them, well, we're not going to kill you, we're not going to invade North Korea, but we're giving you a lesson, just a bloody nose, and we'll beat crap of you if you retaliate, because you still have a lot to lose. And North Koreans won't retaliate. That was the logic, and I think there is a lot into this idea, though we cannot underestimate the human emotions, and emotions are really important and sometimes disregarded in the rational world of strategic analysts. So the uncertainty obviously makes you cautious.
All right, I hear. So it's we're moving towards a very cautious situation where we don't quite know what's going to happen with regards to North Korea or other small arsenals. Maybe if we wrap it up, because for instance, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists in 2017 said that these modernization procedures, especially they focus on these low yield weapons, but also others, the other advancements that we talked about, that they would be undermining strategic stability. And you talked about how this back and forth between missile defense and these weapon developments. So my wrap-up question for you is maybe more broadly, because I know you're working on this, and where do you see the impact for nuclear arms control or the impact on non-proliferation at large?
Well, for non-proliferation, I think the impact might actually be positive, because the value of having nuclear arsenals decreases when it is more vulnerable. However, it creates a huge problem for arms control, and especially for arms control that involves reduction of numbers. What we were used to see in previous US, Soviet Union / US Russia treaties, that the agreed numbers were lower than the previously agreed numbers. And obviously, the lower you go, the less confident you are that your enemy might not be able to somehow eliminate your ability to retaliate. So in this respect, that's a problem. And obviously, there is another problem that more countries needs to be involved in arms control, especially China, which has not been a part of these treaties, and there will be a lot of trouble, which I think in reality needs to focus less on the numbers and less on the technologies that are involved, because we do not know what technologies will emerge in the future, and more on transparency and verification on ability of countries to react to what their adversaries do. So the balance will kind of maintain itself naturally. You see someone whom you are afraid of doing something, so you take precautions. And when you do it transparently, there is a chance that there will be more natural balance.
Great. So we need, what I'm hearing is the bottom line is we need to get more countries involved in arms control, and definitely China. I have a million more questions for you, but sadly we are running low on time. And I thank you so much for joining me here today, discussing these very important issues and taking your time for this project. So thank you very much. And yeah, thank you very much, Professor Ludvík. And hope everyone who watches this, found some valuable lessons.
It was a real pleasure.
Thank you very much.